The microphone was already in her hand when Eleanor Hartwell smiled at the 200 guests seated around the banquet tables and said, "We are so proud of Daniel tonight. He worked hard and he earned this. Of course, some people in his life worked hard too." She paused and looked directly at me. Hard at keeping their son close. Hard at making sure he never outgrew them. Polite laughter rippled across the room. A few people glanced at me with that particular look, the one that is not quite pity and not quite curiosity, but something between the two. My son Daniel sat 3 chairs away, his graduation cap still on, his face going still the way it does when he is trying not to react. His girlfriend Sophia reached under the table and pressed her hand over his. I sat with my back straight and my hands folded in my lap, and I looked at Eleanor Hartwell the way I have learned to look at people who want to see you flinch. I did not flinch. Then Eleanor leaned slightly toward the microphone and said, more softly now but still loud enough, "It takes a village to raise a child. And sometimes it takes a village to finish the job his mother started alone." The room went quieter than it should have. Daniel's jaw tightened. I saw it from 3 chairs away. I pushed back my chair slowly, stood up, smoothed the front of my jacket, and said clearly, "Eleanor, do you know what I did for 31 years before tonight?" Her smile did not disappear all at once. It faded the way light fades when a cloud passes over the sun, slow, then gone. Because the truth is, this night did not begin at the graduation banquet. It began 32 years ago, when my husband left in the middle of winter and did not come back, and I was standing in a kitchen that needed new windows with a toddler on my hip and exactly $400 in a checking account. I do not say what came next to sound like a hero. I say it because it is the reason I know exactly who I am when someone like Eleanor Hartwell tries to tell me otherwise. I raised Daniel alone, and I did it while working the night shift at Mercy General Hospital for 16 years. I am a registered nurse. I have held the hands of people at the worst moments of their lives. I have stayed calm while everything around me was falling apart, and I have learned that the most dangerous people in a room are not the ones who shout. They are the ones who smile while they do damage. Eleanor Hartwell smiles constantly. Daniel met Sophia in his junior year of college. He called me on a Sunday night, which was unusual because Daniel usually texted, and he said, "Mum, I need to tell you about someone." His voice had a warmth in it I had not heard before, the kind that means the person is already somewhere past-like and trying to find the right word for where they actually are. Sophia was studying to be a teacher. She grew up in a small town in Ohio, raised by her grandmother after her parents passed when she was young. She was thoughtful and careful with her words, and she laughed at the right moments, and she looked at my son like he was worth looking at carefully. The first time she came to my apartment for dinner, she asked if she could help in the kitchen, and then she actually helped. Not the kind of helping that is really just standing near someone while they do the work. I liked her immediately. Daniel's father had money, not from working but from inheriting, the kind of money that gets passed down along with certain ideas about who is acceptable and who is not. Daniel had never taken a cent from his father after the man walked out, and his father had apparently decided that made them even. But his father had remarried, and that wife was Eleanor. Eleanor Hartwell had been born Eleanor Marsh somewhere in Connecticut. She had married into the Hartwell name and the Hartwell money the same year Daniel turned 5, and she had spent the years since building a particular kind of life, the kind where everything has a place, and people who do not fit the place are quietly moved elsewhere. The first time I met Eleanor was at a dinner in a restaurant where the portions were small and the prices were not listed on the menu. She greeted me with both hands extended and a smile that went all the way to her eyes and nowhere near her heart. She asked what I did, and when I told her I was a nurse, she nodded and said, "How important," in the tone people use when they mean the opposite. She asked Daniel twice during dinner how the job search was going. When he mentioned a firm in the city that had offered him a position, she said, "Of course there are better options for someone with your degree," and looked at him in a way that did not include me or Sophia in the conversation. On the drive home, Sophia stared out the window for a long time and then said quietly, "She's not going to make this easy." I told her that was probably true. What I did not tell her was that during dinner, when Eleanor leaned across the table to refill her water glass, I had noticed something. A small scar near her left wrist, shaped like a crescent, and something in the back of my mind had stirred the way things stir when you are trying to remember a name that is right at the edge of your memory. I pushed it aside. I had other things to think about. The months before the graduation were full of the kind of interference that is hard to point at directly. Daniel's father quietly mentioned to a partner at the firm Daniel was joining that his son might benefit from more seasoning before a city position. Sophia received a card in the mail with a clipping about a teaching fellowship in another state, with Eleanor's handwriting on a note that said, "Thought you might find this interesting. The restaurant where Daniel had planned to take Sophia for her birthday received a cancellation call from someone claiming to be Daniel. Each time something happened, there was no proof, and there was Eleanor with her hands folded and her smile ready, saying things like, 'I only want what's best for Daniel. And Sophia is lovely, of course, but has she thought about her own path?' Daniel confronted his father once. His father said Eleanor meant well. Daniel called me afterward and said nothing for a moment, and then said, 'How did you do it, Mum? How did you keep going when things kept getting in the way?' I told him the same thing I whispered beside his bed when he was too small to understand it. You keep going because stopping is not actually an option. You keep going because the alternative is letting someone else write your story for you." Then came the graduation. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Daniel walked across that stage, and when they called his name, I stood up before I even thought about it, and I clapped until my palms were sore, and I did not care at all what anyone around me thought about that. Sophia stood next to me and she was crying happy tears, and she grabbed my arm and squeezed it, and I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as complete. Then we moved to the banquet, and Eleanor took the microphone, and I stood up and said, "Eleanor, do you know what I did for 31 years before tonight?" The room was very quiet. Eleanor's smile came back, smaller now. She said lightly, "Why don't you tell us?" So I did. Not loudly, not angrily. I said, "I worked the night shift at a hospital so my son could eat well and sleep safely and go to school with the things he needed. I did not have help. I did not have a second income or a family name or a restaurant account. What I had was my son and my work and 31 years of showing up." I looked at her steadily. "And I will not sit quietly while someone implies that any of that was not enough." The room was so still I could hear the ice shifting in someone's water glass. Daniel's voice came from his chair. "Mum, just that. Just my name, quiet and full." Eleanor laughed softly. A practiced laugh. The kind designed to make the other person seem unreasonable. No one is implying anything. "I was only making a small joke," I said. "It was not funny." And I sat down. I thought that would be the end of it for the evening. I was wrong. About an hour later, I went to find a quieter corner near the hallway outside the banquet room because my feet hurt and the music had gotten louder and I needed 10 minutes of ordinary air. I found a chair near an alcove and I sat down and I closed my eyes for a moment. That was when I heard voices around the corner. Eleanor's voice, low and clipped. The timing is the problem. If he marries her before the estate is reviewed, the provision kicks in automatically. A man's voice, younger, impatient. "Then we move faster." Eleanor said, "We cannot move faster without making it obvious." The lawyer said what we paid him to say. That's different from what's actually possible. I sat very still. Eleanor said, "She cannot find out about the modification. If the girl finds out that Richard changed the will last year, she will go straight to an attorney." The man said, "So we make sure she doesn't find out. Or we make sure they don't get to the point where it matters." A silence. Then Eleanor said, "What about the mother?" The man said, "What about her? She's not as easy to dismiss as I thought." Another silence. Then, "Leave the mother to me." I did not move. I sat in that chair with my hands in my lap, and I made myself breathe slowly, and I thought about what I had just heard. Richard was Daniel's father. The will had been modified. There was a provision that affected Daniel if he married Sophia, and there was someone with Eleanor tonight who was planning to do something about it. I stood up carefully and looked around the corner. Eleanor was gone. But the man was still there, checking his phone. He was perhaps 40, with a narrow face and the kind of expensive haircut that tries too hard. I had seen him earlier at one of the tables, seated near Eleanor's husband. I did not know him, but as I looked at him I felt that same stirring from dinner months ago, the one I had not been able to place. Something about the way he held himself. Something familiar that I could not name. He looked up and saw me. He smiled, and it was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone deciding in real time how to manage an inconvenience. "Mrs. Palmer," he said. He knew my name. "Lovely evening," I said. "I don't believe we've been introduced." He said, "I'm a family friend." Gavin. He put out his hand and I shook it, and in that moment, the thing that had been stirring in the back of my mind finally came forward, and I knew exactly where I had seen him before. Not him. His face. Younger, softer, in a photograph I had looked at many times in a particular file in a particular year that I had spent a long time trying to move past. 17 years ago, I was a charge nurse at Mercy General. We had a situation that year involving a pharmaceutical supplier who had been overcharging the hospital and falsifying delivery records. I had discovered the discrepancy. I had brought it to administration, and then I had spent 6 months being quietly pressured to let it go, to revise my notes, to remember things differently. The man behind the supplier had a name. I had never met him in person, but his photograph had been in the file because the insurance investigator had shown it to me. He had been younger then. He had also been going by a different name. The name on that file had been Harold Crane, and the woman standing with Harold Crane in the photograph, arms linked, smiling for a company event, had been identified in the caption as his business partner. Her name in that photograph had been Eleanor Marsh, before she became Eleanor Hartwell. I looked at Gavin, or whoever he actually was, and I kept my face calm the way I learned to keep it calm in 30 years of night shifts, and I said, "It was nice to meet you," and I walked back toward the banquet room. My mind was working fast. Eleanor had not just been rude to me at dinner. She had not just been making things difficult for Daniel and Sophia out of snobbery. There was something in Richard's estate, a modification, a provision, something that would change depending on whether Daniel married, and Eleanor and this man were working together to prevent that marriage. And Eleanor had once helped a man commit insurance fraud at a hospital where I worked. I found Daniel near the dessert table, talking to one of his professors. I touched his arm lightly and said quietly, "I need to speak with you and Sophia privately. In the next few minutes." Daniel looked at my face and said something brief to his professor, and came with me. I found Sophia near the far end of the room. I brought them both to a quieter corner by the coat check, and I spoke quickly and in a low voice. I told them what I had overheard. I told them about the will modification. I told them about the provision. I did not yet tell them about Eleanor Marsh and the hospital file because I needed to be certain before I said anything about that. Sophia's face went pale. "A provision for what?" she said. I said, "I don't know the details yet, but from what I heard, your marriage affects something in Richard's estate, and Eleanor is trying to prevent it." Daniel's expression was the one I know well, the one where he is taking something in and reorganizing everything he thought he understood. He said, "My father changed his will and didn't tell me." I said, "That's what it sounded like." Sophia said quietly, "She has never wanted me in this family." I knew it wasn't just about how I was raised. I knew it was something else. I put my hand on her arm. "You were right." Then Daniel said, "What do we do?" I said, "First, you stay together for the rest of this evening. You do not go anywhere alone, either of you. Keep your phones with you. And do not let anyone take you into a private conversation without the other one present." Sophia nodded. Daniel looked at me with a steadiness I recognized because I had spent 30 years trying to pass it to him. I went to find Richard. Daniel's father was standing near the bar with 2 men I did not recognize. He was not a bad man. He was a weak one, which is a different problem. When he saw me walking toward him, his posture changed in the small way it always had, a slight tightening around the shoulders that meant he knew he owed something he had not paid. I did not give him room to redirect the conversation. I said, "Richard, I need you to tell me about the modification you made to your will last year." His face changed. He set down his glass. I said, "I overheard Eleanor speaking about it this evening. There is a provision. It involves Daniel's marriage. I need to know what it says." Richard looked at the 2 men beside him and then looked back at me and said, "This isn't the place." I said, "Then find a place. Because if you do not tell me what is in that document, I am going to call an attorney first thing tomorrow morning, and I am going to ask every question I cannot ask you tonight." We moved to a quieter hallway. Richard ran a hand over the back of his neck. He had the look of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and is both relieved and frightened to put it down. He said, "My father left a trust. When I inherited, there were conditions. One of them was that a portion of the estate would pass to my son independently, not through me. If Daniel married before his 35th birthday." He paused. "The condition was that his spouse could not be a current employee or financial dependent of Hartwell Industries. I said, Sophia is a school teacher. I know, so the provision applies to her. Richard was quiet. I said, Does Eleanor work with a man named Gavin? Richard's eyes shifted. He's a consultant. He's worked with Eleanor for several years. I said, What was his name before Gavin? Richard looked at me like he was trying to understand the question. I said, I know Eleanor was once Eleanor Marsh. I know she worked with a man named Harold Crane. And I know that 17 years ago, a supply fraud investigation at the hospital where I worked was shut down before it reached either of them. Richard, I kept copies of every document I gave to that investigator. I kept them because I was told to forget what I knew, and I have never been good at forgetting things I know. Richard sat down in a chair near the wall. He put his hands on his knees. He looked like a man who had built a house on sand and had just felt the ground shift. He said, She told me it was handled. She said it was old business. I said, It is, but it becomes new business very quickly if someone decides to use it. He looked up at me. What do you want? I said, I want you to tell your son tonight what is in that will. I want him to hear it from you, not from a lawyer he has to hire to fight against his own family, and I want that man Gavin out of this building before the evening ends. Richard was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded once. I went back to the banquet room. Eleanor was standing near the centre of the room with a glass of champagne, watching the room the way people watch a room when they are used to controlling what happens in it. When she saw me, she crossed toward me, smooth and unhurried, the way she does everything. She said, I hope there are no hard feelings about earlier. I can be too playful sometimes. I said, Eleanor, I know about the will. Her champagne glass did not move. Her face did not change. But something behind her eyes went very still, the way water goes still right before it freezes. I said, I also know about Harold Crane. And I know about the supply invoices at Mercy General in 2007, she said very quietly. You should be careful about making accusations you cannot support. I said, I have the documents. I made copies 17 years ago and I have kept them because I am a woman who learned early that the truth needs witnesses. Eleanor looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, What exactly do you think you're going to do? I said, I am going to stand here quietly for the rest of this evening. I am not going to make a scene. I am not going to announce anything to anyone in this room. And tomorrow, Daniel will speak with his own attorney about the provision in his grandfather's trust and about the attempts made to interfere with his relationship. I kept my voice even, and if anyone attempts to harm Sophia's reputation, her position, or her future in any way, I will file every document I have with every relevant authority. Is that clear? Eleanor's champagne glass finally came down. She said, You think you've won something? I said, I think my son has won something. I am simply making sure no one takes it from him. She stared at me. Her smile was completely gone now. What was underneath it was smaller and older and honestly more honest. She said, I have money and lawyers and connections that go back 30 years. I looked at her and I said, And I have 32 years of not giving up. I know which one lasts longer. I walked away. What happened in the weeks that followed was not neat or fast. Life is not a movie, and justice moves at its own pace, and sometimes its pace is deeply frustrating. But it moves. Richard sat down with Daniel before the evening ended, and he told him the truth about the trust. Daniel listened without interrupting, which is something he learned from me. And when his father was finished, Daniel said, You could have told me this years ago. Richard did not have a good answer for that. He did not have a good answer for a lot of things, but he told the truth, and that was not nothing. Sophia called me the next morning. She had been awake since early. She said, I knew something was wrong, but I kept telling myself maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was too sensitive. I said, You were not too sensitive. You were correct. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, How did you stay calm? Last night, and all those other times. How did you not just say everything you knew right then and there? I thought about it. I said, Because calm is not the same as quiet. I was not quiet last night. I said what needed to be said. I just did not say it in a way that gave Eleanor anything to twist. The attorney Daniel consulted confirmed that the provision in his grandfather's trust was legitimate and that Sophia met every condition. Eleanor had apparently been attempting for some time to find a legal angle that would disqualify Sophia or delay the trust from vesting. There was no angle. The grandfather had written the provision carefully, as if he had known what his daughter-in-law was capable of. The documents I had kept from 17 years ago went to a financial investigator who had been quietly looking into a pattern of irregularities in Hartwell Industries' contracting records. I do not know exactly what happened after that, because it moved into legal territory I was not part of. But Gavin, whose full legal name turned out to be Jeffrey Harlan Crane, stepped down from his consulting role within 3 months. Eleanor became considerably quieter in the months that followed. Daniel and Sophia got married on a Saturday in September in a small ceremony in a garden outside the city. It was not large. It did not have a head table or a microphone or a banquet hall with chandelier lighting. It had folding chairs and wildflowers and the people who had actually shown up for them over the years. I sat in the front row and I watched my son put a ring on the finger of a woman who had chosen him for exactly who he was, not for what he could inherit or what name he carried. And I thought about the kitchen with the leaking windows and the night shifts and the $400 and all the years in between. Sophia's grandmother had come from Ohio. She was in her 80s and she moved slowly, and she sat beside me during the ceremony. At some point during the vows, she reached over and patted my hand without saying anything, and I understood exactly what she meant. At the small reception afterward, Daniel made a toast. He did not read from notes. He held his glass and he looked at Sophia, and then he looked at me and he said, "I want to say something about the person who taught me what it means to stand your ground, not by fighting, not by being the loudest person in the room, but by refusing to sit down when someone expects you to." He paused. "Mum, I have watched you be brave my entire life. I just didn't always know that's what I was watching. I am not a person who cries easily. It is an occupational hazard of 30 years in nursing. But I cried then. Later, Sophia found me standing near the edge of the garden where the light was going soft and golden in that particular way it does in September. She stood beside me for a moment, looking at the same thing I was looking at, which was Daniel laughing with the 2 friends who had driven 4 hours to be there. She said, "I never thanked you for that night." I said, "You don't need to thank me." She said, "I want to. You didn't have to do what you did. You could have stayed in your seat. You could have let it go and kept the peace." I thought about Eleanor's voice in that hallway, even and cold, saying, "Leave the mother to me." I thought about 32 years of being underestimated by people who confused quietness with weakness. I said, "Here is what I know after 63 years. The peace you keep by staying silent is not real peace. It is borrowed time. Sooner or later, someone calls in the debt, and you end up owing them something you were never willing to give." I looked at her. "You deserve to know the truth. My son deserved to know the truth. And the only way that was going to happen was if someone said it." Sophia nodded slowly. I said, "And one more thing. When someone tells you that you do not belong somewhere, check the source. Ask yourself whether the person telling you that has ever done one honest thing in your presence. If the answer is no, you do not have to accept what they're offering." She smiled. It was a real smile, not the careful managed one she had been using around Eleanor for years. I stayed until the last guest left, and then I helped fold the chairs because that is what you do when you are the mother and you were raised to finish what you started. Daniel carried the last box to the car and walked me to mine and hugged me in the parking lot in the dark for longer than was strictly necessary. When I got home, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and I thought about a lot of things. I thought about the night I sat alone in this same kitchen 32 years ago, and I made myself a promise that I would not let what was hard make me into something I did not want to be. I thought about every night shift and every school form signed at the kitchen table, and every time Daniel called from college and I heard something in his voice that told me the work had meant something. And I thought about Eleanor Hartwell standing in that banquet hall with her champagne glass, perfectly dressed, perfectly controlled, absolutely certain that her money and her connections and her 30 years of managing other people made her the most powerful person in the room. She had been wrong, not because I had more power, but because I had something she did not. I had nothing to hide. The most dangerous thing you can do to someone who runs on secrets is to simply not have any. I had been young, and I had been poor, and I had been alone, and I had worked hard, and I had raised a son who was kind, and I had kept documents in a folder in a filing cabinet for 17 years because I refused to let a lie stay comfortable. None of that was a secret. All of it was just my life, plainly lived. You can threaten someone with exposure only if they are afraid of being seen. I have never been afraid of being seen. Daniel texted me when they got home from their small honeymoon. He said, "Mum, Thank you. For all of it. I wrote back. That's what I'm here for. And that was the truth. Not only that night in the banquet hall, not only for the documents in the filing cabinet, not only for 32 years of showing up, but for exactly this. For being the person my son could count on to still be standing when everything around him was shaking. I poured the rest of my tea down the sink and turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. I slept better than I had in months.